then, until you get that right, then you try something bigger. So this is the type of thing we're seeing. So we're going to ask this question again this coming year. This is this is the number of people on the team. Yeah. So the point is that there are some organizations that are doing very large projects and succeeding at them. Internally within IBM, we've had several Agile projects of over 200. I know for a fact that GBS, Global Services, has done Agile projects of over 200 people successfully for clients. So this is happening. So don't let anybody tell you it has to be small teams. We also asked about iteration length. Even though a lot of people talk about 4 weeks, the most popular iteration length industry-wide seems to be 2 weeks. We've run the same survey internally with IBM, got pretty much the exact same results, which I thought was interesting. So yeah, that's good. So shorter is generally better than longer, because the longer your iteration, the greater at risk you are, because more than likely you're going to start doing mini waterfalls, and you're going to start fooling around, right? So if you've got 6-week iterations or 8-week iterations, what's going to happen, the first couple of weeks you'll be doing paperwork and not really doing anything, and then you won't really get serious about it until the third or 3 or 4 weeks in, when you actually you're getting close to actually having to deliver something. So shortening the iteration squeezes the nonsense out of the projects. So that's probably a good thing. I've been on projects, Agile projects, where we had 1-day iterations. A bit extreme, but it worked. So who's to say, right?
How much is the overhead on that? Considering the sprint planning meeting and all the other stuff, you have an overhead for 1-day sprints. How big is that?
It's a little bit shorter. What's happening now is, okay, so the overhead, percentage-wise, is probably a little bit bigger. So for a 1-day iteration, you'd have you're going to have your sprint meeting anyways, but you're also going to do your planning for the day in the sprint meeting. So you end up with like a half-hour begin the day meeting. Well, you're not going to have a retrospective on 1-day iterations. So you'll do that maybe every Friday afternoon or something. Yeah. So yeah, things get different when you start shortening the iterations. Yeah. Yeah. I personally like 2 weeks myself, but that happens. Okay. So how do you scale Agile software development? So a couple things. First, when you read a lot of the Agile literature, it seems pretty naive. There seems to be this underlying assumption that you're in this co-located room, you're doing greenfield development, you're in complete control of the destiny, your stakeholders can show up every day and they can be on site. You have a big group hug every morning, everybody loves working together, you're all a bunch of professionals and all this sort of stuff, right? No legacy issues to deal with, everything works out fine. All the planets are aligned. Well, if that's your situation, great. But what if it's not, right? What happens if you're geographically distributed? You got team members in different cities, different countries, whatever, right? Suddenly it becomes a little more complex. What happens if you have regulatory compliance issues? You've got some government guidelines you have to follow, right? You get Basel II or Sarbanes-Oxley or whatever else, right? Bad news. Suddenly things become a little more complex. What happens if it's not this big group hug situation where you've got some people in your organization that not only aren't Agile, they're adamantly opposed to it? What happens when you've got data groups that absolutely insist on a big logical data model up front, even though they couldn't possibly justify that? What do you do? What happens when you've got legacy systems in place and there's no tests? What do you do, right? So it becomes more complex. What happens if you're organizationally distributed? You've got contractors in place. You've got different divisions. You've got different companies working together. You've got people from different countries. Like, God help you if you're involved in any sort of government work in the European Union, right? You're going to have multiple countries involved, and they're all scrapping it out, and years later you'll make a decision not to do it. So bad news, right? More complex. And this happens, and it doesn't just happen in Europe, obviously. It's bad news. What happens if you want to get good at governance? Okay, now this is something that the Agile community doesn't like talking about. But the reality is, if you have an IT department doing one or more projects, and I have to think that's your situation, otherwise, what are you doing here? Then you have an IT governance in place. Whether or not that governance program is explicit is an issue, and whether or not it's effective is an issue. Most governance programs seem to be rather ineffective. And the reason why is because governance is often left to the bureaucrats. And when you leave governance to the bureaucrats, surprise, surprise, you will end up with a bureaucratic governance process, right? So part of my message to the Agile community is time to grow up and accept the fact that there's some non-sexy things that we need to deal with. Because if we don't take responsibility for the bigger issues, we're going to have these crazy governance programs enforced upon us. Okay, that might not be a good strategy. So anyways, we need to deal with this. What happens if we got big teams? What happens if we have very complex applications? Suddenly things become more complex, right? So this is what happens at scale. So scaling is not just a team size thing and not just a distribution thing. The things that, is the popular issues right now to be dealing with, we have all these other factors as well. And any given project will be in different situations, will find themselves in different situations. And this makes it hard for management. There's this concept of having repeatable processes. Everybody follows the same process and everything will work out. That is completely naive. Repeatable process is not the issue. Repeatable results are. And that's a big difference. So if I've got different teams in different situations, they will have to follow different processes or at least different flavors of the same process. Because inherently we know a team of 3 people works differently than a team of 30 people, right? Obviously. We know that a team building a data warehouse will work differently than a team building a website, than a team building a packaged software, than a team building satellite software. We know this, right? We're going to have different processes for that. We know that a team that's co-located will work differently than a team that's distributed, obviously. So this is something that can be pretty tough in a lot of organizations. So scaling really requires great flexibility. So the part of the message here is that Agile's relative. Different teams are going to find themselves in different situations. You're going to follow different processes. You'll have different combinations of tools. So what works well for a small co-located team will be a complete disaster for a distributed team of 200 people, right? So we need to start respecting that. A team that has compliance issues will do more documentation than a team that does not. So, the world's different. So what are some of the techniques that you can use to scale Agile software development? One of them actually comes from me is Agile modeling. So the idea here, now modeling and documentation are not the most popular concepts amongst the Agile community, and yet we're all doing it. So in the Agile Adoption Survey, I started looking into what levels of modeling are people doing. 93% of Agilists are doing whiteboard sketching. Well, that's modeling. 66% are doing paper modeling, which I thought was strange because considering all the talk that we hear about index cards and post-it notes and almost nothing about whiteboarding, and yet far more people are doing whiteboarding. So anyways, and they're both good. I'm a firm believer in index cards, don't get me wrong. People are doing, here's where we go against the Agile religion. People are doing some initial Agile requirements modeling. They're doing some initial architecture modeling. Because in the real world, not in Agile fantasy land, not in what you read in the mailing list,